That makes things better. Okay, so back to Art Deco. We've defined it as a certain type of style that mixes both modernist, exoticist, and traditional aesthetics. And of course, it was present in the 20s and 30s. Now, in terms of historiography, where does it all come from? Why is it called that? The term that we use today for Art Deco is borrowed from a very influential exhibition or exposition that was held in 1925 in Paris, called the International Exposition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Art. So in French, it was Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes. The key adjective in that sentence is modern. Now, we think of deco or decorative as being the key aspect, but it was an exhibition of arts and in decoration and industry and design, and the key adjective is modern. And we'll see soon why that is important. The exhibition was intended for 1915. It had been planned for 1915, but obviously World War I intervened. And so they held it 10 years later in 1925 as a process of reconstruction. Now, why did they hold this event? That had been planned and obviously superseded by the war. Paris, since the 18th century certainly, and through the 19th century, was the global center of the luxury and art industries and trade. And those industries, which had always been important in trade, became huge during the Edwardian age, because obviously a very large middle class was created, and just the absolute amount of wealth at the global level skyrocketed in the late part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. So this was big money. And for France, it was a huge source of income, and they wanted to retain that primacy, that role. And as a result of that, they put a lot of money, invested a lot in this international exposition. So at the time that it was introduced, what we now called Art Deco was called modernistic or art moderne or art modern in English. And so it stood in contrast to more traditional styles, like some of the historicist styles and the neoclassical styles that have been popular in the Victorian age and in the Edwardian age. So if you compare on the left Buckingham Palace, which the facade of which was rebuilt in 1913, which is what you see currently, and the Hoover Factory from 20 years later, 1933, both in or around London, you go from traditional to modern, and clearly there's a big difference in style here. But as the century progressed, there were a number of modern styles, and there was an increasing divergence between the relatively brief period of modern that we refer to now as Art Deco and the direction in which modern architecture had moved, which was more minimalist, the so-called international style, the Bauhaus style. And so if we compare the Hoover Factory with the National Theatre, it's clearly difficult to group two buildings or two styles or two aesthetic conceptions as different as those under one single moniker. And modernist and modern stuck to the more minimalist and spare style, and something different had to be created to describe what we now call Art Deco. The Art Deco term was introduced in the 1960s. So before the 1960s, people don't really talk about Art Deco. Bevis Hillier in particular wrote a book and organized an exhibition, and that popularized the name. I'm not 100% sure he's the first one to use that terminology, but certainly one of the early ones. And there have been a number of exhibitions, even just in London. There was an important one in 1979 at the Hayward Gallery, and I think the biggest and best one in relatively recent years was in 2003 at the V&A. So this style, this aesthetic vision obviously existed in the 20s and 30s, but began to be codified as one style and be part of art history as Art Deco really after the war. So what are some of the characteristics of Art Deco? So my definition is that it's a style that mixes modernist and exoticist devices as well as traditional aesthetics from the West. Now, in terms of exoticism, In Art Deco, you see there are a lot of non-European visual references, references to Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, pre-Columbian America, all kinds of non-European references, some African references, some Oriental. And also there's a very non-traditional use of color and texture, especially in buildings. Through most of Western history, from the Middle Ages until the Victorian era, with a few exceptions in the Victorian era, most buildings had the same color as the main material they were built with or faced with. And from the Art Nouveau period onward, you start seeing the use of very rich textures and glazing and colored tiles and just a lot of color. Now, those non-European visual references and the non-traditional use of color and texture was already quite popular before World War I. If you look at Art Nouveau, which was popular from the 1890s to the 1910s, that already introduced some of these themes, some of these factors. And in that sense, I think that there's some continuity from Art Nouveau to Art Deco. In fact, I think that some of the big split or the sharp division that art historians draw between them are really a consequence of World War I, which created such a huge cataclysmic shift between one cost of European culture in the long 19th century and the 20th century proper. But stylistically, there are definitely some elements of continuity with Art Nouveau. In addition to that, you have something that Art Nouveau didn't present in any way, which is a fascination with industrialization and technology and what was called then the machine age. So mechanics, speed, modernity, science. Another factor that was new or certainly much more emphasized relative to Art Nouveau was the introduction of abstraction and geometry over greater naturalism and likelihood and verisimilitude in the depiction of the human form or natural forms. And that second streak of modernist devices is more in line with a broader modernist body of work. So it's typical of the Bauhaus, this idea of post-artistic architecture that eschews ornament. Art Deco does not eschew ornament, but it does have some of this stylization and abstraction. So that's a characteristic. And here we have some examples of non-European visual references. I think many of you will be familiar with the Carter cigarette factory in North London, which has, Egyptian-style lotus capital columns and other Egyptian motifs. Ziggurat mantelpieces were very, very popular in this country in the 30s. They were mostly ripped out after that. They became very unpopular. But that's an Art Deco piece, but it references Mesopotamia, and especially in the U.S. and throughout Latin America, Mayan discoveries of Mayan temples and ruins were very prominent in the interwar period, and they were incorporated in the Art Deco canon. And in terms of non-traditional use of color and texture and surface on buildings, again, you might be familiar with Ideal House near Liberty in central London. It's covered in black, very jet black tiling and stone, and then it's got this gold decorative motif towards the top of the building. You see that a department store somewhere in the Midwest covered in turquoise glazed, very brilliant tiles. And of course, you're all familiar with the metallic, shiny skin of the top of the Chrysler building, which is obviously also interesting from the point of view of introducing aspects of mechanization and themes of the machine age to what is actually just a building and not a machine. There is a constant reference in Art Deco to ocean liners, airplanes, cars, streamlined steam locomotives, the idea of speed and modernity. And the extreme version of that is Streamline Modern, which is a compromise between Art Deco proper and Bauhaus, whereby you have streamlining of all sorts of things that never really encounter any air resistance because they're not objects that you sort of throw about or move. There could be buildings, or you can see that clock there, nicely streamlined. So it's purely an aesthetic device, but it speaks of the fascination of that time with mechanical advances. And here we see what we mean by abstraction. If you look at the human figure on the left, it's kind of heroic human, muscular human figure, you can see that it's squared out and made more abstract and not as naturalistic as might have been portrayed in a classical sculpture or even an Art Nouveau sculpture. And the same goes with those nice swirls in that decorative panel, terracotta decorative panel in the middle. It's certainly based on naturalistic forms, but it's rendered more abstract and therefore more modern and more streamlined, and then again with that urn. So far we've talked about the departures of Art Deco from traditional Western aesthetics, so exotic, new, modern and machine age oriented. But there's also a sense of continuity in Art Deco, and we'll see it when we talk about some of the architectural qualities of Art Deco buildings. They're very much inspired by proportions and arrangements that are quite old and based on classical architecture. So in Art Deco, you have continuity as well as change. There's plenty of change and novelty, but you're not throwing out everything. And I think that's because the ethos of Art Deco was to return to the prosperity, the liveliness that had existed in the Belle Epoque, in the Gilded Age before World War I. And as a result, what you find in Art Deco, which is very different from most art movements of the 20th century, is that although it obviously has an underlying ideological narrative, it's a fairly straightforward one. And it's not as full of ideological cant as some of the other ones. So there is no approach, there's no great love of functionalism or structuralism or avant-gardism. And let me illustrate what I mean by that. So here we see some classic Art Deco images. We Austin Reed advertisement, the lobby of the Chrysler building, and another ad for basically just traveling by rail. And if you look at the richness of color and material and the sexiness almost of the artwork and the expression, clearly this is a very positive, very alluring, seductive style. It's not trying to be too edgy or too challenging. It's trying to seduce the viewer, albeit introducing some new, modern, more stylized forms. I spoke before about ideological content. So there's no functionalism. There's no great love of functionalism in Art Deco. On the left, you can see a radiator grill. I think it's in the Chenin building in New York City. Now, a radiator grill is useful. It doesn't need to be as ornate as that. And a modernist, a proper Bauhaus modernist, would never have contemplated a radiator grill of this kind of richness and detail, because the idea was to make everything just purely functional. Well, Art Deco doesn't do that. It also avoids another aspect of modernism, of the other modern movements, which was avant-gardism. And avant-gardism is this idea that if something is popular, if many people like it, it can't be any good. It's not challenging enough. And Art Deco absolutely avoided that. A lot of Art Deco production was very popular and oriented towards a mass consumption and mass culture. And I think as one historian of art put it, Art Deco has never really been forgiven for being fun. All the other art movements of the period were perhaps, well, not perhaps, certainly much more serious and self-important than Art Deco. So having looked at the characteristics of Art Deco so far, and I think I've already adumbrated some of the aspects that I personally find interesting, what is particularly good about Art Deco? And I'll talk about 4 different subsections. One is the diversity of expression that is inherent to the Art Deco ethos. Then I'll talk about the architectural coherence and quality. And I'll briefly mention its accessibility and also the versatility of the style. By diversity of expression, what I mean is, and I've already mentioned this in one of the earlier slides in some ways, is that Art Deco is a compromise that works, which is what grown-ups do. They compromise because the world is difficult and complex and there are different points of view. So in the early part of the 20th century, especially after World War One, and you can see that in a lot of important buildings built in the 1920s. There's a battle going on between utter traditionalists, young fogies, or old fogies actually, who want to just turn the clock back to 1900 and build very nice Edwardian buildings and have Edwardian fashions and Edwardian mores and Edwardian manners. And against that, you have a fairly radical challenge to that says, no, that stuff is gone. We've got to get past that in every possible way. And Art Deco really kind of compromises between those two. It innovates, but it doesn't completely divorce itself from the past. So I think that Art Deco, in a way, is a very pluralist style. Obviously, World War One was a catastrophe, and it was a self-made catastrophe. It was a catastrophe created by European, or if you prefer, Western culture. And it had such a huge impact on society and on people and the conception of themselves and their society that you had two very different responses. And here I'm being very simplistic, but you can think of them as reform and reset. And what I mean by that is that the reforming zeal is a positivist vision. The idea that rational, scientific, clever people can eventually reach some kind of agreement. It is also built, reform that is built on the idea that you already achieved quite a bit, but it needs to be further improved. And underlying this approach is the idea that problems are complex, and it's legitimate for society to have different viewpoints and different aspirations within it. And therefore, you have to move gradually and by steps that everyone or many people agree to. And so an example of some reformist policies might be the expansion of the vote for women, right? Almost every country, certainly all European countries, had universal male suffrage by 1914. And in the years after that, they gradually introduced female suffrage. Another example of reform is social welfare state. So you don't completely change the economic model, but you make much more generous allowances for redistribution and management of the economy on the part of the community. And a perhaps unsuccessful but noble type of reformist policy was the attempt to establish the League of Nations. Against that, you have the reset. And the idea that after World War One you have to reset and start from a blank slate is fairly nihilistic. We have failed thoroughly. Maybe not me and my buddies that were in that particular unit, but society as a whole has failed very badly. It takes different forms, obviously, in the countries that lost, like Germany, as opposed to countries that won the war, like the UK and France and Italy, but which still had borne a tremendous cost. But in all cases, you have some kind of refusal and rejection of the past, and it's a wholesale rejection. It's not, we need to improve things, we need to change things. No, we have to start completely anew. And so then you have strongman politics, a totalitarian state, and rather than trying to achieve peace, you have strong revanchist and expansionist systems. Now, we have to be a little bit careful. Architecture and ideology are not the same thing. You can dislike Art Deco, and it doesn't mean you're a fascist or a communist. Okay, but there is, I think, a parallel, at least a psychological or philosophical parallel, in value hierarchies between complexity and pluralism and simplicity and unity and purity. And I think if you look at the different streams of modern aesthetics and architecture and focus, you can see some of that. So if you look at the Art Deco building on the left, it's a car dealership. It was a car dealership. And there's a nice picture of a 1920s car and some traffic lights here and a certain amount of decoration on what is actually, clearly a steel-framed and modern building. So it has some modernity, but it also hews back to the tradition, to a very long-lived tradition of depicting sculpturally what the building is for and who it's by and so forth. On the right, you have a famous building in Chicago by Mies van der Rohe, who was one of the most prominent and I think also most talented modernist architects. And that's an example of purity. unless somebody tells you, you have no idea what happens in the building other than it's probably offices. There's no retail on the ground floor, that there wasn't initially. It's very simple. It's like almost like a monolith. And again, we see complexity on the left, Art Deco, a lot of decoration, a lot of smaller details, and purity. There's no decoration in brutalist building. It just does what it says on the tin. It's got the stairs, it's got the ceiling, it's got the roof, it's got floors and walls, but there are no doodads on it. So it's a very essential kind of approach. And here we see again, the contrast in some interiors. And I've chosen, in both cases, interiors that in each style would be considered fairly luxurious and competently done. You have complexity on the left and purity on the right. So that's the bit about compromise and adaptability. Now let's talk about architectural coherence, or what I would say architectural quality. Art Deco carries over a number of characteristics which are typical of the broader classical tradition. You have the tripartite or three-part organization. You have a degree of symmetry. You also have a subordination of elements so that the buildings are legible. And yet another characteristic of traditional architecture, not just classical architecture, you tend to have detail rather than articulation for relief of mass, which is very important. Let's start with the tripartite organization. This is not an Art Deco building, as you can see. It's a neoclassical building. It's Childs Bank in Fleet Street. And it is vertically divided into three parts, as almost all classical buildings are. It has a base element, a main or intermediate element, and then a terminal element, which here is very simple. It's just a corniche. It also has a tripartite organization along the horizontal axis. It has a middle and two sides called the ante, which are different from the middle, which of course highlights the characteristics of each. And you can see that repeated in this Art Deco building, which is the Carlisle Hotel in South Beach. It has a base. It's unfortunately in this picture, it's kind of obscured by the umbrellas, but it's got a very open terrace sort of base. It then has a middle element where the rooms are, and then a terminal element with a terrace and the extended piers. And as you can see, those extended piers don't do anything. Any structural role they may have played ended here at the roofline. But they terminate the building. They help it meet the sky. Again, on the horizontal axis, you have the two sides are different from the middle. So you have the ante and the corpus, like in a classical building. And elements of this tripartite organization are found in most Art Deco buildings. If you look at the Chenin building, which is a very large building in New York, clearly has a base, a main body, and then it terminates with quite a large tower. It also follows a sort of ziggurat theme. Now that was partly because of zoning laws in New York City, but it was emphasized and retained beyond what was merely a legal requirement because they just like the aesthetics of it. And here you have a much smaller building. It's really not much bigger than a couple of family houses, which is the annex to the Hoover factory in London. And you can see all kinds of tripartite divisions. There's a base, there's a middle, there's a top, there are the two sides in the middle. It's quite well organized in that sense. And again, looking at tripartite organization and symmetry, these buildings, there are buildings all over the world. The Prefecture building is in Yokohama in Japan. The Carbide building is in New York. Bloom High School, if I remember correctly, is in Chicago. So different specific looks and ornamental devices, but a similar type of organization. The next thing that makes Art Deco more like classical architecture than modernist architecture is the idea that you're going to relieve mass through detail. The problem of mass is that buildings are big. Most buildings are quite big, and once you start having steel frame buildings, they can be huge, just gigantic. And therefore, they're not human scale. You have this huge block looming over this little tiny person, and it is not ideal. It's not psychologically comfortable. it tends to minimize the worth of the people that work in that building or have to walk around it or live in it. And so one way of relieving mass is by having a very complex set of voids and spaces, which architects call articulation. So you create a very complex shape. The complex shapes are difficult to use. It's difficult to fit all the uses you want in it. They're also quite costly to build. And once you're inside the building, they make the building very difficult to navigate. Now, obviously, this is a facetious example, but you can see you went from this big lumpy cube that's just crushing that tiny human to something that is perhaps, the mass is relieved, but it's almost too complex to comprehend. And that's a characteristic, for instance, in recent years of so-called deconstructivist style, whereby the shape of the building is quite complex. This is an example. It's a library. I think it's a library. No, sorry, it's a museum in Edmonton, Canada. And as you can see, the building is quite complex in its shape, and the windows and voids are very unpredictable. They don't follow a regular pattern. They're sort of in almost random spaces. And it does look a little bit like the Death Starship of some alien invader about to crush that little man there. The other way to relieve mass is detail. So if you look, we go back to Child's Bank, which is a classical building. It's a box. It's just one big box. It's a biggish box. It's not a huge building, but it's not tiny. But it has a lot of openings, windows and doors, and they're regular. They're where you would expect them to be. They're not kind of randomly assigned on the facade. It also has a lot of little details like the columns or secondary structures like those little protruding arches where the entrances are. But none of these things change the fact that it's a box. And so it's very easy to use inside. It would be very easy to change and alter. And certainly with modern manufacturing techniques, the details aren't terribly expensive, especially once we get to Art Deco. And here we see that applied in Art Deco. You see, you have two buildings, one in Napier and one in Durban, South Africa. And they're both basically boxes. They're very simple buildings. There's no massive, complex articulation, but they have lots of windows. The windows are regularly spaced. The buildings are symmetric. And there's plenty of detail, whether it's the color or the ornament or the small details that jut out of the building and then regress again. They don't really change the shape of the building in any significant way architecturally, but they do relieve the mass, so they make it seem less looming and imposing and crushing. Next, we have subordination of elements. Now, this building is the famous Lloyd's of London. It's probably the most admired example of so-called high-tech style in the modernist genre. And it's a very complex building. Now, it's quite useful when you come to a building, especially for the first time, to know which is the front, which is the back, the sides, where the entrance is. I went to that building twice at a distance of about 10 years and had a bugger of a time finding the entrance. It's very, very difficult. It's kind of hidden behind there. These are secondary. These are more like escape routes. The actual entrance is in the retained 1920s building next to it. But it's difficult. It's a very difficult building to read. It wants to be complex. I don't think it wants you to get it at first glance. Funnily enough, in the same building at the back, there is a huge soaring postmodern atrium. If they put the entrance at the bottom of this atrium, it would have been very easy to spot. That would have been a good subordination of elements. Well, in Art Deco, you tend to have that. So take this quite large building, the Union Guardian Trust. This is in Chicago. The entrance is very easy to spot, right? Because it's inside a big vaulting niche with lots of decoration. There are more decorative elements near the entrance than on the general wall, like those two big guardians, low relief guardians standing guard to the bank vault and so forth. But it's very legible. Yeah, there's no question. If you approach that building from any direction, you'd say, okay, that's the entrance. That's where I need to go in. Here is another example of an Art Deco building. This is the Rex Cinema in Paris. And in this case, the entrance, the main foyer, are accessed from the corner, which is actually quite an old-fashioned way of doing it. It's almost Edwardian conception, but it's an Art Deco building. And so what they've done is that they've made the corner, which typically can be nice architecturally in a building, but not as remarkable, particularly remarkable. So they put all the windows there, where the stairs are, and a big tower with a lit up sign. So that's the focus of the building. There's a secondary entrance for the Rex Club. That too has signage, less architectural, more just in terms of signage, to let you know that that's where the entrance is. So there's a clear subordination of elements. One other aspect of Art Deco architecture that I think is quite attractive, not necessarily from an aesthetic point of view, but perhaps from a social, you could say even moral point of view, the accessibility. There are some very fancy, very expensive Art Deco buildings, but you can make very attractive, popular, well-liked Art Deco buildings with very little money. And South Beach is the perfect example of that. You know, South Beach was built during the Depression. All the hotels and restaurants and cafes there were supposed to be built for lower middle class people, traveling as cheaply as possible for a little bit of sun. And they were quite cheaply built. A little bit of neon, a little slap of paint, and some interesting shapes, as you can see in the news cafe there. And you have an attractive building that can be enjoyed by people that aren't billionaires or millionaires or rich. It's very accessible. One specific item that I think is I've always thought is fascinating in Art Deco architecture, especially nautical or beach Art Deco, are the so-called eyebrows. See those things that stick out on top of the windows and shade the window from excess sun. They're super cheap to build. You basically just extend part of the floor plate, the slip part of the floor plate, outward. So it's reinforced concrete. They're indestructible. They don't need a lot of maintenance. Unlike some added cornices and ornament that you have in earlier buildings, these are very low maintenance. They're very nice. You can color them a different color for extra effect. And you know, they're not expensive. They're not something that requires a Michelangelo. You know, any workman can produce eyebrows. So that was accessibility. Let's talk about versatility. One of the reasons that was given, especially in the 20th century, for a radical change in the approach to architecture was that there were lots of new types of buildings. You know, technology advanced very rapidly, so we had elevators and steel frames, so skyscrapers, airline terminals, hangars, factories, you know, all kinds of things that Gothic and classical architects didn't have to deal with. You know, they built churches and temples and courts, but not too many airline terminals. Now, if you're a very, very good architect like Cass Gilbert, you can build a nice Gothic skyscraper like the Woolworth building in New York. But it's not easy. And I think there's only so far you can take it. Art Deco is a modern style. It was invented in the modern era when these innovations and this technological progress was already taking place. So it adapts very well, both in terms of scale, but also in terms of usage. And let me give you some examples. One of the things that's striking is, before we get to different typologies, is the geometric versatility of Art Deco. You think about the Empire State Building, which is a very tall and comparatively narrow building. The Art Deco works well. But then if you look at this former factory, this is in West London on the Great Western Road. It's a very low, very wide building, and it works equally well. And all those factors that we talked about, symmetry, tripartite division, readability, subordination of parts, all help these buildings be successful, even though they have very different shapes. It's also noteworthy that Art Deco works very well for small buildings, typically in a simpler expression of Art Deco. And you can see that little building there somewhere in Florida. And it works fairly well for very massive buildings like the Barclay VZ building in New York, which I have to admit this, if you're actually at ground level on the sidewalk, does look like a huge cliff. but at least from a distance, it's not one giant lump because of the use of Art Deco styling. It was obviously applied very successfully to train stations. You can see the central train station in Milan, then below that is the famous train station in Cleveland, one in Pennsylvania. And even that example in the upper right-hand corner in Woking, here in the UK, it's not a famous or prominent or particularly beautiful Art Deco building. It's much more modest than the other ones in this page. But you can see by just putting that sweet curve at each angle, which doesn't really do anything. I mean, it probably helps the visibility at the windows a little bit if you're looking at the trains, but it just makes it flow, and it's streamlined even though that building isn't going anywhere. And it just makes it a little bit less pedestrian than it would have to be if you just built it with straight angles. Hotels, obviously, are a famous application of Art Deco architecture. And it's worked very well in some quite lush hotels like the Delano, but also some of the cheaper hotels. And you can see that, in this country in particular, at the seaside and sort of seaside resorts like Bournemouth and a number of places, really, you have some quite good examples of Art Deco hotels. And then cinemas. I mean, the movies became big, really, really big, during the heyday of Art Deco. And so there are a lot of beautiful Art Deco cinemas all over the world. And they fitted that typology, that used particularly well, in that many cinemas had large blank walls, not so much fenestration being a theater, but they were able to make that, to relieve that mass and to make that look appealing and attractive and fun, which is, of course, what you want when you go into the cinema. Airports are another typical example of successful Art Deco architecture. My personal favorite is that the one on the top, which I believe is in Birmingham, and was the old airline terminal, which is built to look like an airplane. So it's got wings, and it's streamlined. If this was some kind of Popeye cartoon, at some point you'd eat spinach and the building would be propelled and it would start flying through the air. But the other pictures are from the old airline terminal in Las Vegas. But you can see that, as new types of buildings were required, Art Deco was quite versatile in fulfilling that brief. And not least, a lot of great industrial buildings. This was the age of great industries. It's late into the industrial age, but certainly in the industrial age. And, think of the Battersea Power Station and the Gillette factory and other buildings of that sort. They fulfilled their practical purpose, or they did when they were being used for their original purpose. But they also have a certain elan, a certain aesthetic quality to them that's not just utilitarian. So those are the things that I think make Art Deco a particularly successful style, and one that I think is very unlikely to be brought back, but should be at some point by someone. That's not me, by the way, when I was younger. That's Errol Flynn. I wish I looked like that when I was younger. I'm going to add a few more slides here. So a little bit of history. This is a very sad Art Deco loss. This was the Firestone tire factory, built in 1932. Not very far from where I live. It's in Brentford, or it was in Brentford. And there's a nasty story there because Michael Heseltine was going to list the building, so it couldn't be torn down. And some genius from the Department of the Environment called up the developers, and they sent in, on the weekend, they sent in bulldozers and tore it down. Mockingly, they kept the original gates, which are nice, but they weren't the nicest thing about the building. And then they built something very pedestrian and pointless behind it. And it's also not particularly taller. That bit I don't get. If you're going to tear down a nice building, at least add some floor plates. I'm going to talk about a few Art Deco architects, and then we'll be finished. You'll be happy to hear. One of the earliest architects that built something that you can call Art Deco was Eric Mendelsohn. And this actually is a good time to point some of the inconsistencies in art history terminology. You're not allowed to call Mendelssohn's work Art Deco because, for instance, the building on the right, the famous Einstein Tower, that was built, certainly designed, and I think also built before World War One, so before the Art Deco exhibition. But it's clearly an Art Deco building. It has lots of the elements of it. It has some Art Nouveau elements, but the spareness, the abstraction, the flowing and streamlined shapes, clearly has a lot of elements of Art Deco. There's also Pierre Patou, Frenchman. He was responsible for several of the pavilions at the 1925 exhibition. You can see the French one there on the right. And you can see the inspiration is clearly classical, but the ornament and the specific shapes and aesthetics are modern and more abstracted and new and exciting. Then you have Raymond Hood in the States. I think his most famous building is a radiator building that you can see in the middle. And Hood is a good chance to mention the fact that most architects that produce some very nice Art Deco buildings did not build a lot of Art Deco buildings because the style didn't last for very long. So Raymond Hood, if you look at his entire work, his oeuvre, it's mostly modernist buildings. Very little got built during the war. So he built some of these buildings in the 30s. Then during the war, nothing was built. And after the war, modernism was a thing. And so, you needed to work. And, he wasn't really an innovator of Hood. He was more of a very good implementer of styles that others had invented. And so most of the buildings by Hood are the Art Deco ones. Are modernist. They're not Art Deco. But he's still best known for his Art Deco buildings. Another Frenchman was Jean Carlou. One of the things that he's responsible for is the Trocadero Center in Paris. And he was particularly skilled, I think, in applying also interiors and lights to Art Deco buildings. You have William Van Alen back in the States. He is the architect that designed the Chrysler building, but he also did some good work on some much less known and smaller buildings with a sort of still staying within that aesthetic. The other thing about Art Deco is that because it has decoration, in addition to the architects, I'll skip back to this, there are a tremendous number of great sculptors and artists. I'm only mentioning Lee Laurie here. He is particularly well known. But there's dozens and dozens of them that worked on these buildings and added that gentility, that grace, that aesthetic dimension. And they're usually not as well remembered as the architects. And I think it's a pity because those Art Deco buildings, without the decoration and the applied ornament, would be relatively pedestrian concrete boxes. I also wanted to mention Claude Bielman. He worked mostly in LA, but a lot of the better Art Deco buildings in LA are by Bielman. So these are some architects you can look up. I hope the presentation has been reasonably clear, not too slow, not too fast, but it's very difficult to gauge doing it essentially into a camera and without an audience. But that basically is the end of the presentation. I think Clayton mentioned that people can enter questions if they have any questions or comments in the live chat, and if so, and you're still willing to hang around, I'll entertain questions. I'm not sure whether I should give the answers on the live stream or on the chat, but I will try to do so by live stream, just because it's well, I guess it's a little bit easier to follow than the typing. So Louise asks, are there any examples of Art Deco revival buildings out there? Very few. Walt Disney, which you know, by definition engages in pastiche, built one of their hotels near one of their resorts in an Art Deco style, with some of their characters featuring in it. It wasn't very highly considered by architects, but there's very, very little. And in fact, there are still Art Deco buildings being torn down. It's very difficult to build an historicist in revival styles these days. It goes against everything that the architectural profession believes in. And the only style really where you have people trying to build new ones today is a classical style. And there's some prominent architects, but there must be some revival Art Deco, but I'm not aware of any major buildings. Incy Spider asks, what part did you think the revivalist Egyptian style had on Art Deco, especially the Tutankhamun fad? It had a very significant impact. Not only do we see Egyptian style details on a number of Art Deco buildings, typically cinemas, but also, or places of entertainment, but also some industrial buildings, as you saw in the Carter cigarette factory. Not only that, but I think some of the quality of the decoration, the use of gold and enamel and lapis, and some of these things that were so prominent in the Tutankhamun finds were clearly reflected in Art Deco styles and furniture and design. So yeah, it was probably the single biggest exotic influence on Art Deco, certainly a very important one. The Earl of K asks, what is your favorite Art Deco building? That's like asking me which one is my favorite child. I can't say I have a favorite. I think generally, well, I prefer the very decorated Deco buildings. So my favorite in London is the Hoover Factory. I think it's just a spectacular building. It looks nice during the day, at night, when it's lit up. Most buildings look better at dusk with some light and some sunlight. It looks good when the sky is gray. You know, it's just a fantastic building. Unfortunately, it's not in a great position. It's on the A40, and but that's a great building here in London. Let's see, another question. Okay, so MG Driver says, our house seems to be willfully not tripartite and asymmetric. As a key deco feature, is this unusual in architecture? I think, okay, so that's a very interesting question, actually. It's a deep architecture question. The smaller the building is, the harder it is to make it work while being strictly symmetric and while introducing, base, a middle, and a top. Now, if you have a two-story building, you can put a base, a middle, and a top, but I mean, they won't be that significant. And in a way, you don't need it for the building to be legible. And certainly putting a door in the middle in a house-sized building creates circulation issues. So think about the typical semi-detached house, even in Victorian and Edwardian times. It has elements of symmetry, but that's because each house on each side is the mirror copy of the other, but they're not individually symmetric, right? So, and that's true of basic Georgian houses and so forth. So I think unless you have at least 4 or 5 window bays in width, well, actually 5, you can't really make it symmetric and make it work very well. So as you get towards smaller buildings, the deco elements will be more in the streamlining or the shape of the windows, perhaps the applied decoration, and less in the formal organization of the building. So it's not unusual, no, for a house not to have all those characteristics. Incy asks, do you see the Canary Wharf Tower as revivalist Art Deco? Um, you're talking about the yeah, the early one, the pointy one. Can't remember now what it's called. Um, I think it's probably more postmodern than Art Deco, but you know, some people think that Art Deco was the first postmodern. Um, it has some of those visual clues, doesn't it? It has a shape at the top. It doesn't just end like a mesa, like a tabletop. And it has some indents and step backs. So in that sense, I think is a little bit reminiscent of that. Um, the overall, if you look at the module, you know, if you take a chunk of any part of the building or the walls, it's a little bit too open and repetitive, I think, to be quite Art Deco, but it certainly makes some concessions to legibility and to relief of mass. Tim Ayer asks, where are the world's most notable clusters of Art Deco buildings? Well, as you yourself mentioned, Tim, Napier, New Zealand is famous because it was rebuilt almost, you know, it has a huge cluster of Art Deco buildings. They're particularly nice and they're also mostly small scale. So if you want to see successful detached small scale Art Deco buildings, that's a great place to go. South Beach in Miami has obviously a famous cluster of Art Deco hotels and commercial buildings. London didn't build a tremendous number of Art Deco buildings, but there are some fine ones. The answer really would be any place that did really well in the 20s and 30s, especially in the 20s. So there are some, you know, they're not all in one part of the city, but there's a tremendous amount of good Art Deco in New York City. And let me think, where else? LA obviously has, you know, it was a boom town in the 20s. So unfortunately, they've torn a fair amount of stuff down. And right now, I'm sure when we finish this, I'll think of 10 more places and I'll kick myself. But if anybody thinks of any other places, they should type them into the live chat. Robert Shed says Tel Aviv, White City is lovely. Yes, I think Tel Aviv, which is lovely, is probably at the far edge of Art Deco. It's probably more Bauhaus than Art Deco because it was done intelligently and sympathetically, and or streamlined modern at least, and they painted it white, which always helps as opposed to raw concrete. It definitely has that unity of style, and it's you're right. There are a lot of really good 1930s buildings there. Yeah, that's and you know they're still used, and most of them where I mean there's cinemas and places like that, but you know a lot of it is just residential, and so they're still used for their original purpose, which tends to be good for buildings. When you change the use of a building, often you have to make some compromises with the architecture or with the original architecture. MG Driver said Frinton-on-Sea. Yeah, I'm aware there are some there. There's one section of Bournemouth that has 2 or 3 at least, but probably more, Art Deco buildings in close proximity. And of course, the 20s and the 30s is a period when not just a few people, but mass group of people started going to beaches and having summer holidays all over the place. So seaside resorts often have some nice Art Deco survivals all over Europe. Look, see, we have more suggestions here. Leon Solent, both in Great Britain and easy to find. Yeah. I'm trying to think if there are other cities that are particularly, or places, a lot of Art Deco. Right now I can't think of any, but I'm sure there are plenty of them. I am going to end the live stream now just because there's a bit of a lag and I don't want people to completely fall asleep. And I'll try and hook back into Zoom to see if there's anybody still on Zoom. Thanks everyone for listening, and I might do a little bit of editing afterwards, and then yeah, this will be available for people afterwards via YouTube. Thanks very much.